I am Evelyn. For 30 years, I was the woman behind the man, the silent partner who built Richard into the titan he is today. We live in a sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by high hedges and even higher expectations. I thought our life was a masterpiece, but one afternoon, a misplaced iPad revealed it was all a sketch. Richard was planning to leave me. He wasn't just leaving for a younger woman named Chloe. He was planning to leave me with nothing by hiding our joint assets in shell companies before filing for divorce. The discovery did not make me scream. It made me cold. I realized that if I acted like a grieving wife, I would lose. If I acted like a predator, I would win. I needed to know Chloe, but not as the woman whose husband she was stealing. I created a new version of myself named Diane. Diane was a wealthy, retired interior designer with a penchant for expensive tea and even more expensive gossip. I tracked Chloe to a high-end Pilates studio in the city. As Diane, I struck up a conversation about a designer handbag she was carrying, a bag I knew Richard had bought her with our anniversary money. Within 2 weeks, we were having lunch. Chloe was young, ambitious, and surprisingly lonely. She saw Richard as her golden ticket, unaware that he was planning to discard her just as easily as he was discarding me. I listened as she boasted about the secret accounts Richard was setting up in her name, thinking she was the one in control. The first cliffhanger came when I realized Richard hadn't just hidden $5 million. He had moved nearly $40 million into accounts Chloe had the passwords to. My plan required a specific document, a post-nuptial agreement. Our original prenup from 30 years ago was stingy, written when we had nothing. To get Richard to sign a new one, I had to play on his greed. As Diane, I told Chloe that Richard was being investigated by the tax authorities. I planted the seed that he was going to use her as a scapegoat. I told her the only way to protect herself, and the money he promised her, was to make sure he signed a document that tied his personal wealth to our marriage until the very day of a legal separation. I went home to Richard and played the part of the worried, doting wife. I told him I wanted to protect our legacy from potential lawsuits. I proposed a lifestyle post-nup that looked like it protected him, but tucked deep inside the simple language was a clause. If he committed any financial infidelity, the entirety of his business holdings would transfer to me. He laughed, thinking I was a fool who didn't know about his secret hoards. He signed it while smiling at me, already thinking about his future with Chloe. The second cliffhanger arrived when I sent Chloe a photo of Richard with another, even younger woman, proving to her that she was just a temporary placeholder. The final phase was the switch. I met Chloe one last time, not as Diane, but as Evelyn. I showed her the evidence of Richard's plan to frame her for his tax evasion. I offered her a choice. She could go down with him, or she could give me the passwords to the offshore accounts and walk away with $1 million consulting fee from me. She didn't hesitate. She handed over the digital keys, realizing that being my ally was far more profitable than being Richard's mistress. The trap was set. Richard thought he was preparing to serve me divorce papers on a Tuesday morning. He didn't know that by Monday night, the offshore accounts were empty, and the post-nup he signed had already been triggered by his own paper trail of lies. The final cliffhanger is the moment Richard opens his banking app at breakfast, only to find a balance of 0 and a message from my lawyer. Richard stood in the doorway, his face purple with a rage I had never seen, holding the folder I thought I had hidden. He found the trail, the numbers, and the truth. Most women would have collapsed or begged for mercy. I did neither. I simply reached for the kettle. The steam rose as I ground the beans, the rich aroma filling the kitchen while his hands shook with a terror he couldn't hide. He thought he caught me, but he actually just stepped into the light. The sound of the coffee beans hitting the metal blades was loud, a sharp grinding noise that drowned out his first 3 insults. Richard was screaming about loyalty. He was screaming about the house and the money, and how I had no right to look through his private office. I didn't look at him. I watched the dark powder fall into the filter. I noticed how my hands didn't shake. For 30 years, my hands had shaken every time he raised his voice. If he didn't like the dinner, I trembled. If he came home late and smelled like expensive perfume that wasn't mine, I shivered under the covers. But today, the silence was my armor. He slammed the folder down on the marble island. It was a beautiful piece of stone, cold and white, just like the life we had built together. The papers inside were the bank statements I had spent months gathering. They showed the flow of money from our joint savings into a company called Blue Horizon. It was a poetic name for a man who wanted a new horizon with a woman half my age. Richard thought he was the one doing the discovering. He thought he had caught me spying. He didn't realize that I wanted him to find those papers. I had left them in his top drawer on purpose. The smell of the coffee began to fill the room. It was a dark roast, the kind he liked, though I had always preferred something lighter. I poured the hot water slowly, watching the bloom of the grounds. Richard stopped shouting. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to apologize or explain why I was tracking his investments. When I didn't speak, I could hear his breathing change. It went from the huffing of a bull to the shallow, quick breaths of a man who realized he was standing in a room he didn't recognize. I finally looked at him. His tie was loose, and his hair, which he usually kept perfectly combed, was messy. He looked old. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a giant. I saw a scared little man who had built a kingdom on a foundation of lies. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, but it was exactly what I needed. I thought about all the parties I had hosted for his clients, the thousands of hours I spent making sure his life was seamless so he could focus on his career. I had been the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect ghost. He asked me what I wanted. His voice was lower now, almost a whisper. He tried to use that tone he used in boardrooms, the one meant to intimidate. But I just smiled at him over the rim of my cup. I told him that I didn't want anything he thought I wanted. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want him to break up with Chloe. I didn't even want the house anymore. I told him that the folder on the table wasn't the only one. There were 4 more just like it, already sitting in the offices of people who find financial discrepancies very interesting. The color drained from his face. He reached for the folder, but I didn't move to stop him. He could burn those papers, and it wouldn't matter. He started talking about our history, about the kids, about how we could fix this. It was pathetic. He was trying to buy time, trying to find a way to spin his betrayal into a misunderstanding. But the more he talked, the more I realized that I had already left him months ago. My heart had moved out the day I found the first receipt for a diamond necklace that never touched my neck. I walked past him toward the window that overlooked our garden. The roses were in bloom, deep red and vibrant. I had planted them myself. I remembered the dirt under my fingernails and the way my back ached after a day in the sun. Richard had never helped. He had never even commented on how beautiful they were. He just expected them to be there, just like he expected me to be there. I told him that the locks would be changed by tomorrow, but not for the reasons he thought. I wasn't kicking him out of the house. I was locking myself into a new life. The air in the kitchen felt different now. The tension was still there, but it wasn't my tension anymore. It belonged to him. He was looking at the phone on the counter, probably wondering if he should call his lawyer or his mistress. I knew he wouldn't call Chloe. Men like Richard only value women like Chloe when things are easy. As soon as the walls start closing in, they see them as liabilities. I almost felt sorry for her. She thought she was winning a prize, but she was really just inheriting a sinking ship. I put my cup down and smoothed my skirt. I felt a strange sense of peace. It was the kind of peace you get after a long fever breaks. The world looks sharper, clearer. I told Richard that he should probably go upstairs and pack a bag. I told him to take the good suits because he was going to need to look successful for a very long time if he wanted anyone to believe his side of the story. He didn't move. He just stared at me as if I were a stranger, and in a way, I was. I was the woman he had ignored for 3 decades, and now I was the only person who held his future in my hands. I thought about the years I spent making sure his shirts were pressed and his favorite meals were ready. I thought about the times I had covered for his mistakes and made him look like a genius in front of his peers. All that effort, all that love, had been channeled into a man who thought I was a piece of furniture. Well, the furniture had moved. The silent partner was finally speaking, and the only language I was using was the one he understood best, the language of loss. He tried to grab my arm as I started to walk away, but I stepped back. I didn't do it with fear. I did it with a quiet authority that stopped him in his tracks. I told him that if he touched me, the process would go much faster and much more painfully for him. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. It was a small victory, but it felt better than any gift he had ever bought me. I walked out of the kitchen and left him standing there with his cold coffee and his useless folder. The hallway was long and filled with photos of our life. Photos of vacations in Italy, photos of the kids' graduations, photos of us laughing at Christmas. I looked at them and didn't feel any sadness. I just saw a series of well-staged plays. We were good actors, I had to give us that. But the curtains were closing, and I was the only one who had the keys to the theater. I went into the library and sat behind the large oak desk that Richard loved so much. It was a position of power, and I liked how it felt. I opened my laptop and looked at the spreadsheets one last time. Everything was in place. The accounts were tracked, the timeline was established, and the witnesses were ready. Richard thought he was playing a game of checkers, but I had been playing chess for months. He was just now realizing that he was in checkmate, and he hadn't even made his first move. I took a deep breath and felt the weight of the last 30 years lift off my shoulders. It was finally time to show him what happens when the silent wife finds her voice. Subscribe and comment where you are watching from, because the best revenge was the one she never had to explain. The rain in the city that afternoon was not a storm. It was a thin gray drizzle that turned the sidewalks into mirrors and made the lights of the yellow taxis look like blurred smears of paint. I had finished my charity board meeting an hour early and decided to walk. I liked the city when it rained. It felt honest. Usually I would have called Richard to see if he wanted to meet for an early cocktail, but my phone had died an hour ago. I felt a strange sense of freedom in not being reachable. I decided to head toward a small, very exclusive Italian restaurant called Vito's. It was tucked away on a side street, the kind of place where the waiters knew your name but never repeated it to anyone else. It was Richard's favorite spot for business lunches. I didn't intend to spy. I truly didn't. I just wanted a glass of red wine and a moment of quiet before heading back to the big, empty house in Greenwich. But as I approached the restaurant, I saw his car. The black sedan was parked illegally near the entrance, and his driver, Marcus, was leaning against the door with a look of bored patience. My heart didn't hammer. It just went still. I pulled my umbrella lower and walked past the main entrance, heading toward a small flower shop directly across the street. From behind a display of damp roses, I looked through the large, fogged windows of the restaurant. There he was. Richard was sitting in the very back, in a booth that was partially hidden by a large marble pillar. He wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was a woman who looked like a high-definition version of the girl I used to be. She was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with long blonde hair that fell over her shoulders in perfect, expensive waves. She was wearing a silk blouse in a shade of cream that made her skin look like porcelain, but it wasn't her beauty that stopped my breath. It was the way Richard was looking at her. For 30 years, I had been the recipient of Richard's glances. I knew his distracted look, his bored look, and his public look. But I hadn't seen this look in decades. He was leaning forward, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes fixed on her, as if she were the only thing in the room. He reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb traced circles over her knuckles, a gesture he used to do to me when we were in our 20s and had nothing but a shared studio apartment and a dream of a bigger life. I watched as he laughed at something she said. It wasn't the sharp, performative laugh he used at galas. It was soft, it was genuine. She didn't know what I knew. As I stood there, the cold rain soaking into the hem of my coat, I felt a strange sense of pity for her. She saw a powerful man, a titan of industry who could buy her anything she wanted. She saw the gold watch and the custom-tailored suit. She didn't see the man who complained about the temperature of his soup for 20 minutes. She didn't see the man who forgot his own children's birthdays unless I put them in his calendar. She didn't know that every ounce of his success was built on the back of my family's initial investment and my own tireless networking. She thought she was winning a prize. She didn't realize she was just the latest accessory in a life he had grown bored of. Then, the blue box appeared. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small velvet box across the white tablecloth. I knew that box. It was from a jeweler on Fifth Avenue where we had a private account. He had told me last week that he was closing that account because the fees were too high. Another lie. The girl opened the box, and even from across the street, I saw the flash of diamonds. It was a bracelet. Not just any bracelet, but a piece I had admired in a catalog months ago. He had told me it was gaudy. He told her it was perfect. She leaned over the table and kissed him, and for a second I had to close my eyes. The pain was there, sharp and hot, but beneath it, something else was forming. It was a cold, hard clarity. If I walked in there now, I would be the hysterical wife. Richard would apologize, he would call it a mistake, and he would use his army of lawyers to make sure I left with nothing but the clothes on my back. Our prenuptial agreement was 30 years old and heavily favored him. He had spent the last decade moving assets into accounts I couldn't touch. If I reacted now, I would lose. I turned away and started walking. I didn't look back. I walked 3 blocks in the rain until I found a quiet cafe. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, my mind working like a calculator. I started thinking about our house, the properties in Aspen and Florida, the investment portfolios, and the secret accounts I had suspected existed but never bothered to track. Richard thought I was a soft woman who lived for gardening and charity luncheons. He thought my silence over the years was a sign of weakness. He didn't realize it was a sign of observation. I went home before him. I made sure the house was warm and smelled of cedar and expensive candles. I changed into a soft cashmere lounge set and sat in the library with a book I wasn't reading. When I heard his car pull into the driveway an hour later, I didn't move. I heard him enter the foyer, heard him give his coat to the housekeeper, and heard his heavy footsteps on the hardwood. He walked into the library, smelling of rain and that expensive Italian wine. He came over and kissed the top of my head. He told me the meeting had run late and that the city was a mess. I looked up at him and smiled. It was the best performance of my life. I told him I had missed him and asked if he wanted a drink. He said no, he was exhausted and wanted to head up to bed. As he turned to leave the room, he paused. He looked at me for a second longer than usual, as if checking to see if the mask was slipping. I kept my expression perfectly serene. I was the loyal, quiet wife he had come to expect. As soon as I heard the shower running upstairs, I went to the kitchen. His briefcase was sitting on the island. I didn't open it. I knew Richard was too smart to leave physical evidence in a bag, but I noticed his phone sitting right next to it. He had forgotten it in his rush to wash the scent of the girl off his skin. A notification lit up the screen. It was a text from an unsaved number. It said, The offshore transfer for the Chloe Trust is complete. Check your private email for the confirmation. I didn't touch the phone. I just stared at the name. Chloe. So that was her name. And he was already setting up a trust for her. He wasn't just having an affair. He was preparing a retirement plan that didn't include me. He was moving the money out of our reach, bit by bit, thinking I would never notice the missing millions. I walked back to the library and sat in the dark. I realized that the man I had loved for 30 years was gone, and in his place was a stranger who wanted to erase me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just picked up a pen and a small notebook I kept in the desk drawer. I wrote down the words, Chloe Trust. Then I wrote, offshore transfer. My plan wouldn't take days, it would take months. I had to find a way to make Richard trust me more than he ever had before. I had to become his most devoted ally while I quietly dismantled his empire from the inside. The next morning, Richard was at the breakfast table, reading the Wall Street Journal as if nothing had happened. I poured him his coffee, exactly the way he liked it. I told him I had been thinking about our future, and that I wanted to get more involved in the family office. I told him I wanted to help him manage the estate so he could focus on his big deals. He looked up, a small, patronizing smile on his lips. He told me that was a wonderful idea and that he would have his assistant set up a login for me. He thought he was giving me a toy to play with to keep me busy. He didn't realize he had just given me the keys to his vault. As he left for the office, I watched his car disappear down the long, winding driveway. I went up to our bedroom and looked at the jewelry box on my dresser. I took out my wedding ring and looked at the inscription inside. Forever, it said. I put it back and closed the lid. Forever was a long time, but my patience was longer. I had already made a list of the people I needed to call. The first was a man Richard hated, a forensic accountant who had once nearly bankrupted one of Richard's rivals. But before I could make that call, the house phone rang. It was the security gate. A delivery was arriving for me. When I went down to the front door, the courier handed me a large, heavy envelope. There was no return address. Inside was a stack of photographs. They weren't of Richard and Chloe at the restaurant. They were photos of me, standing across the street in the rain, watching them. On the back of the top photo, a single sentence was written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. He isn't the only one with secrets, Evelyn. I stood in the foyer, the photos trembling in my hand. Someone else was watching us. Someone who knew exactly what I had seen and was waiting to see what I would do next. The game had started before I was even ready to play. The anonymous envelope sat on my nightstand for 3 days. Every time I looked at it, I felt a surge of adrenaline that I had not felt in years. Someone knew. Someone was watching me watch Richard. Instead of being afraid, I felt validated. I was not the only one who saw the cracks in the golden life we had built. I spent those 3 days becoming Diane. Diane was a woman who did not exist, but she was more real to me than Evelyn had been in a long time. I drove to a part of the city where no one would recognize me, a small shop that sold prepaid phones for cash. The clerk did not even look up from his magazine as I handed over the bills. The phone felt light and cheap in my hand, a plastic tool for a plastic world. I sat in my car for a long time before I turned the phone on. I had Chloe's number from the text message I saw on Richard's phone. It was etched into my brain. I practiced my voice. I needed to sound older than Chloe, but younger than myself. I needed to sound like someone who had money but did not need to brag about it. I needed to sound like a friend she had not made yet. I cleared my throat and dialed the number. My heart was a steady drum in my chest, not racing, just marking the time until the explosion. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was light and airy, with a little lift at the end of every sentence that made her sound like she was always asking a question. "Hello?" she said. I took a breath and smiled. I have learned that people can hear a smile over the phone. It makes them feel safe. Hello, Chloe, I said. My name is Diane. I hope I am not calling at a bad time. There was a pause. I could almost hear her trying to place the name in her mental list of rich people. Do I know you? She asked, her voice cautious but curious. I laughed softly. It was a practiced sound, the kind of laugh you hear at a country club brunch. Not directly, I told her, but we have a very close mutual friend who mentioned your name. I am an interior designer, and I was told you have an incredible eye for detail. I am working on a project for a very private client in the city, and I am looking for someone with a fresh perspective to help me source some very specific pieces. Our friend thought you might be interested in a little consulting work. It would be very discreet, of course. I knew exactly which buttons to push. Chloe was a girl who wanted to be seen as important. She did not just want Richard's money. She wanted the status that came with it. By calling her an expert and offering her a job that sounded exclusive and secret, I was giving her exactly what she craved. I could hear her ego inflating through the receiver. "Oh," she said, and her voice lost that edge of suspicion. "Which friend?" "I cannot say over the phone," I replied, keeping my tone warm and mysterious. "My client is very particular about their privacy, but I am sure you can guess the circles we move in." We talked for 15 minutes. I let her do most of the talking. She told me about her passion for modern art and how she had been helping a friend decorate a new office. I listened to her describe the colors and the fabrics, and it took every ounce of my will not to tell her that I was the one who had chosen the decor for every office Richard had ever owned. I was the one who knew his favorite shade of blue and the exact height he liked his desk to be. But I just hummed in agreement and told her she had wonderful taste. As she spoke, I looked out the window at my garden. The roses were still there, but they looked different now. They did not look like something I had nurtured. They looked like a boundary I was about to cross. I realized that Chloe was not a villain in her own story. She was just a girl who thought she found a shortcut to the life she wanted. She did not realize that the man she was with would never truly see her. To Richard, she was just a mirror that reflected a younger, more powerful version of himself. I was going to use that mirror to break him. I told her that I would love to show her some of the sketches for my current project. I suggested a small, quiet coffee shop near the park. It was far enough from Richard's office that we would not be seen, but close enough to the high-end boutiques that Chloe would feel comfortable. "I can meet you on Thursday afternoon," she said. I could hear the excitement in her voice. She thought she was starting a new chapter in her career. She had no idea she was walking into a trap I had been building for 30 years. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my car for a long time. I felt a strange sense of calm. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I looked at the burner phone and then at my own wedding ring. I thought about Richard and how he would be home in a few hours, probably smelling like her perfume again. He would sit at the dinner table and tell me about his day, and I would listen and nod and play the part of the devoted wife. But now I had a secret of my own. I had Chloe's trust, or at least the beginning of it. I spent the rest of the evening preparing. I went through old magazines and cut out pictures of rooms that I knew Chloe would like. I created a portfolio for Diane, something that looked professional and expensive. I even bought a new perfume, something floral and light, nothing like the deep, musky scents I usually wore. I wanted to be a completely different person when I met her. I wanted to be the woman she wanted to become. When Richard came home that night, he was in a good mood. He brought me a bouquet of lilies, my favorite. He kissed me on the cheek and told me he had a great day at the office. I thanked him for the flowers and put them in a vase, but as soon as he left the room, I threw them in the trash. I did not need his flowers anymore. I had something much better. I had a plan that was moving faster than I had ever hoped. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run. I wanted to feel my body moving, to feel the strength in my legs. I was no longer the woman who stood in the rain and watched her husband with another woman. I was the woman who was going to take everything back. I checked the burner phone one last time. There was a message from Chloe. It said, "Looking forward to meeting you, Diane." I smiled as I deleted the message. She was so eager. It was almost too easy. But as I was getting ready for my day, I remembered the anonymous photos. Who had sent them? And why? I knew I could not ignore that part of the puzzle. Someone was playing their own game. And I was just one of the pieces. I needed to find out who my silent partner was before they decided to change the rules. I decided to make a detour on my way to the coffee shop. I had a friend who specialized in digital footprints, someone Richard did not know about. I needed to know who was behind that camera. I drove toward the city, the skyline rising up like a wall of glass and steel. I felt like a soldier going into battle. But instead of a gun, I had a leather portfolio and a fake name. I was ready for Chloe. I was ready for Richard. And I was ready for whoever was watching me from the shadows. The coffee shop was just around the corner, and I could see Chloe through the window, sitting at a small table and checking her reflection in her phone. She looked nervous and excited. She did not see me yet. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp and cool, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the pavement with a steady, confident rhythm. I was about to meet the woman who was trying to steal my life, and I was going to offer her a cup of coffee. It was the first move in a game that Richard did not even know he was playing. And as I reached for the door handle, I realized that the hardest part was not going to be the revenge. The hardest part was going to be keeping a straight face when she told me how much she loved him. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with curiosity. I smiled and raised my hand in a small wave. "Chloe?" I asked, my voice smooth and friendly. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Yes," she said. "You must be Diane." I reached out and took her hand, feeling the soft, uncalloused skin. "It is so lovely to finally meet you," I said. "We have so much to talk about." We sat down, and the waiter came over to take our order. I watched her as she looked at the menu, noticing the way she tilted her head and the way she played with the diamond bracelet on her wrist. The same bracelet I had seen Richard give her in the rain. I felt a flicker of anger, but I pushed it down. It was just a piece of jewelry. Soon, I would have everything else. We started with small talk about the weather and the city, but I could tell she was itching to get to the point. She wanted to know about the job, about the money, and about the person who had recommended her. I leaned in closer, as if sharing a secret. I told her that my client was a very wealthy man who was looking to set up a private residence for someone very special to him. I saw her eyes light up. She thought I was talking about her. She thought I was working for Richard. I let her believe it. I did not say his name, but I used all the right words. I talked about discretion and luxury and building a future. She was hanging on every word, her guard completely down. By the time we finished our coffee, she was convinced that I was her new best friend. She told me about her dreams of opening her own gallery and how she was finally with someone who supported her. She even showed me a picture of him on her phone, but she covered his face with her thumb. "He is a very important man," she whispered. "I know," I replied. "I can tell you have very high standards." We agreed to meet again the following week to go over the first set of designs. As we walked out of the shop, she gave me a quick hug. I felt the cold metal of her bracelet against my arm. "Thank you so much, Diane," she said. "This means the world to me." I watched her walk away, her head held high, thinking she had just caught the biggest break of her life. I waited until she was out of sight before I got back into my car. I took out the burner phone and looked at the call log. Everything was going according to plan. But then, my other phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. It said, "You are doing great, Evelyn. but do not get too close to the fire. You might get burned. Over the next 4 weeks, my life became a series of carefully constructed performances. At home in Greenwich, I was the perfect, oblivious wife. I made sure Richard's favorite silk shirts were pressed, and I listened with a gentle smile as he talked about his latest acquisitions. I even started asking him for advice on my small gardening budget, playing into his need to feel like the sole provider and the smartest man in the room. He loved it. He would pat my hand and tell me not to worry about the numbers, that he had everything under control. He felt so safe that he began leaving his laptop open on the study desk more often. He thought I was too simple to understand the spreadsheets and the encrypted files. He didn't realize that every night, while he slept the heavy sleep of a man who thinks he has won, I was photographing every screen and every document. But the real work happened in the city. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I became Diane. I met Chloe at different spots. A quiet bistro near the library, a rooftop garden that was empty in the mid-afternoon, and once, a very expensive tea room where the clinking of china drowned out our whispers. Chloe was changing. The bright, eager girl I had met the first time was being replaced by someone much more guarded. I could see the stress in the way she twisted her rings and the way she checked her phone every 2 minutes. She was beginning to realize that being the mistress of a powerful man was not the fairy tale she had imagined. I started feeding her the poison slowly, 1 drop at a time. I didn't tell her Richard was a liar. I told her that the industry was full of men who looked successful, but were actually drowning. During our 3rd lunch, I brought a thick folder of what I called market research. I accidentally let a page slip out. It was a copy of a public record showing a massive tax lien on a property Richard had told her he owned outright. I watched her eyes widen as she read the numbers. I pulled the paper back quickly, acting embarrassed. "Oh, ignore that," I said with a nervous little laugh. "It is just a sad example of how some men in this city use debt to buy their way into certain circles. It is all smoke and mirrors, really." She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at her salad. I knew what she was thinking. Richard had promised her that the apartment he was looking at for her was a cash purchase. Now she was seeing proof that he couldn't even pay the taxes on his own vacation home. I leaned in and lowered my voice, playing the role of the concerned mentor. "You know, Chloe, I have seen this before. A man wants to impress a beautiful woman. So he moves money around like a shell game. He opens accounts in her name, tells her she is a partner, but really he is just using her as a shield. If the bank comes calling, his name isn't on the debt. Hers is." I saw the color drain from her face. I knew Richard had already started the process of putting some of his riskier assets into a trust with her name on it. He told her it was a gift, a way to ensure her future. I made sure she understood it was a trap. I told her a story about another girl, a girl named Sarah, who ended up $500,000 in debt because she signed papers her boyfriend told her were just for a new car. "Sarah went to prison for bank fraud," I whispered. "And the man? He just moved on to the next girl. He had plausible deniability. He told the judge he had no idea she was forging his signature." Chloe reached for her glass of wine, but her hand was shaking so badly she had to put it back down. "Is there a way to check?" she asked. Her voice was thin and brittle. I smiled at her, a look of pure maternal kindness. "Of course, dear. You just have to know where to look. I can show you how to pull a credit report on a corporation. It is all public information if you know the right codes." I took out a small piece of paper and wrote down a series of numbers and a website. "These are the filings for the company that owns that apartment you mentioned. Just look at the date of the last mortgage." That night, I went home and found Richard in the library, drinking a glass of scotch and looking very pleased with himself. He told me he had just closed a deal that would secure our future for the next 20 years. He tried to pull me into his lap, but I moved away gracefully, pretending I had to check on the roast in the oven. I felt a surge of disgust so strong, I thought I might be sick. He was still lying, even now. Even when he didn't have to. He was so addicted to the thrill of the cheat that he couldn't stop. I realized then that I wasn't just doing this for the money or the revenge. I was doing it because men like Richard need to be stopped. They leave a trail of broken lives behind them and call it the cost of doing business. The next week, Chloe showed up to our lunch without any makeup on. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying for days. She didn't even look at the menu. She pulled a folded piece of paper out of her bag and pushed it across the table toward me. "You were right," she said. "The mortgage on the apartment is 3 months past due. And there are other things." I looked at the credit cards he gave me. I called the bank, and they told me the primary account holder isn't Richard. It is a company I have never heard of, based in the Cayman Islands. I nodded slowly, letting the silence hang between us. I didn't push her. I let her reach the conclusion on her own. She was realizing that her golden ticket was printed on a sinking ship. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for help. "What do I do, Diane? If I leave him now, I have nothing. I am tied to those debts." I signed the papers. I told her there was a way out, but it required nerves of steel. I told her that if she could get me the account numbers for that Cayman company, I could find a way to sever her legal connection to the debt. I told her I had a friend at the Treasury who owed me a favor. It was a lie, of course. I didn't have a friend at the Treasury. I just needed those account numbers. They were the last pieces of the puzzle I needed to trigger the post-nuptial agreement Richard had signed. If I could prove he was moving marital assets into a mistress's name through a foreign shell company, the clause would kick in automatically. He would lose the business, the house, and every cent he had hidden. Chloe looked at me, and for a second, I thought she might see through the mask. I thought she might realize that Diane was too good to be true, but her fear was greater than her suspicion. She nodded. "He keeps a black ledger in his safe at the office," she said. "He thinks I don't know the code, but I watched him open it once. I can get the numbers." I told her to be careful, to wait for the right moment. I told her that once we had the numbers, she would be free. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt a strange sense of exhaustion. The game was reaching its peak. I had turned Richard's mistress into my best informant, and I had turned his own greed into his cage. But the most surprising thing happened when I pulled into my driveway. There, sitting on the front porch, was a small wooden box. It wasn't from a jeweler. It was old and weathered. I opened it and found a single key and a note. The note was written in the same handwriting as the photos. It said, "The safe code is his mother's birthday, not his anniversary. Use the key for the bottom drawer." I looked around the empty driveway, my heart pounding. Someone was helping me. Someone who knew Richard even better than I did. I took the key and the note and went inside, the silence of the house feeling heavier than ever. I knew exactly which bottom drawer the note was talking about. It was the one in his private study, the one he kept locked even when he was in the room. I was no longer just a wife or a designer named Diane. I was the center of a storm, and the final move was only a few days away. The cliffhanger came that evening when Richard walked into the kitchen and told me he wanted to take a trip. "Just the two of us," he said. "To the islands. We can leave on Friday." I looked at him and smiled, knowing that Friday was the day the banks would be closing his accounts. I wondered if he knew the islands were where his money used to be before I started moving it. Richard stood by the window of our dining room, looking out at the dark expanse of the lawn. The moonlight caught the gray at his temples, making him look distinguished, like a man who had everything under control. He had no idea that the world he built was already beginning to tilt. I had spent the afternoon preparing for this evening. I wanted everything to be perfect, not because I loved him, but because a man is most vulnerable when he feels adored. I had set the table with our finest linens, The ones we usually saved for visiting dignitaries or the rare occasions when our children came home. The scent of roasted lamb and rosemary drifted from the kitchen, a comforting, domestic smell that suggested safety and tradition. I walked up behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He actually leaned into my touch, a rare sign of affection that made my skin crawl, but I kept my hand steady. I told him how much I was looking forward to our trip to the islands. I told him it felt like we were finally getting back to the way things used to be. He turned around and smiled at me, that polished, boardroom smile that usually worked on everyone. "You deserve a break, Evelyn," he said. "We both do. It has been a long year." I nodded, leading him toward the table. I poured him a glass of the heavy red wine he loved, the kind that cost more than most people made in a week. As we ate, I began to weave the web. I didn't talk about money or business. I talked about us. I reminded him of the small apartment we had in the city when we first started out. I reminded him of the night we sat on the floor because we couldn't afford a sofa and dreamed about the life we have now. I saw his eyes glaze over with nostalgia. Richard loved the story of his own rise to power. He loved being reminded that he was a self-made man. I played the part of the grateful witness to his greatness. I told him that I had been thinking about our legacy and how I wanted to make sure everything we built stayed together, no matter what. I reached into my small evening bag and pulled out a folder. It was wrapped in a blue ribbon, looking more like a gift than a legal document. I saw a flash of suspicion in his eyes, but I moved quickly to quiet it. I told him that I had been working on a surprise for our anniversary. I called it a renewal of our partnership. I explained that I wanted to simplify our estate so we wouldn't have to worry about it during our golden years. I told him it was a way to put all our holdings into one protected circle, a fortress that no one could ever break into. I used words like forever and unity and protection. I avoided words like liability or transfer. He took the folder and opened it. I watched his eyes move across the pages. I knew he was looking for the red flags, the things a man like him usually looks for. But I had prepared for that. I had the document drafted by a lawyer who knew how to hide a mountain behind a molehill. The language was simple and flowery. It talked about the mutual respect between husband and wife, and the desire to share all burdens and blessings equally. To Richard, it looked like a sentimental gesture from a woman who was finally admitting she couldn't handle the complexities of their wealth. He thought I was handing him more control, not taking it away. He flipped through the pages, his thumb grazing the heavy parchment. "This is very thorough, Evelyn," he remarked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I didn't realize you were so interested in the structure of the trusts." I gave him a shy, slightly embarrassed smile. I told him that I just wanted to feel secure. I told him that with all the uncertainty in the world, I wanted to know that we were one single unit. I told him that if he signed this, it would be the most romantic thing he had ever done for me. I told him it was better than any diamond or any trip to the islands. It was a promise that we were in this together, until the very end. I watched him weigh the options in his mind. He was thinking about Chloe. He was thinking about the offshore accounts he had already set up. He probably thought that signing this would be the perfect way to keep me quiet. If he signed a document that looked this devoted, I would never suspect him of anything else. It was the perfect cover for his own betrayals. He thought he was outsmarting me. He thought he was humoring his aging wife while he prepared for his new life with a younger woman. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, calculating how this would make his eventual exit even easier, because I would be so blindsided. I leaned across the table and touched his hand. "Richard, please," I whispered. "Let us start our trip with this settled. Let us go to the islands as the team we used to be." I saw the last of his resistance melt away. He was a man who couldn't say no to a woman who made him feel like a king. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his gold fountain pen. He liked the weight of it, the way it made his signature look like a piece of history. He unscrewed the cap and held the pen over the signature line. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The house was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. My heart was a steady beat in my chest, a drum counting down the seconds. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched that gold nib hover over the paper. He looked at me one last time, searching my face for any sign of a trap. I gave him nothing but a look of pure, adoring trust. I was the woman who had stood by him for 30 years. I was the woman who had never questioned him. I was the woman he thought he knew. He pressed the pen to the paper. I watched the dark ink flow out, forming the loops and lines of his name. It was a firm signature, bold and confident. He signed the first page, then the second, then the final page where our names sat side by side. He capped the pen with a satisfying click and pushed the folder back toward me. "There you go," he said, his voice warm and patronizing. "Happy anniversary, Evelyn." I took the folder and held it against my heart. I felt the heat of the paper, the weight of the life he had just signed away. "Thank you, Richard," I said, and my voice was as smooth as glass. "You have no idea what this means to me." He stood up and suggested we go to the library for a final drink before bed. He was in a wonderful mood, already talking about the private jet and the weather in the Caribbean. I followed him, the folder tucked under my arm like a shield. I looked at the signature through the translucent paper of the folder. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He had just signed a document that redefined every secret account and every hidden property as a joint asset that he could no longer move without my written consent. He had just walked into a vault and locked the door from the inside. As we sat in the library, I watched him sip his scotch. He looked so relaxed, so sure of his victory. He started telling me about a new project he was working on, something he said would be his greatest achievement yet. I listened, and I nodded, but my mind was already on the next day. I thought about the key in my pocket and the black ledger in his office. I thought about the look on his face when he would eventually realize that the islands were not a vacation, but the place where his empire would finally run aground. He leaned back in his leather chair and closed his eyes for a moment, a small smile on his lips. I stood up and told him I was going to head up to bed to finish my packing. I kissed him on the forehead, a cold, final gesture that he took as a sign of affection. I walked out of the library and up the stairs, my heels silent on the thick carpet. I went into my dressing room and opened my safe. I placed the signed document inside and locked it. The click of the lock was the loudest sound in the world. I stood there for a long time looking at the closed safe. I thought about the girl I was 30 years ago and the woman I had become. I wasn't the silent wife anymore. I was the architect of his ruin. I went to the window and looked out at the driveway. Tomorrow morning, a courier would arrive to take a copy of that document to my lawyers and to the banks. By the time Richard and I reached the airport on Friday, he would be a man with a name, but no power. The final move was ready. I turned off the light and sat in the darkness, waiting for the sun to rise on the last day of the life Richard thought he owned. The only thing left was to see what was inside that black ledger. And I knew that whatever I found would be the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I could almost hear the sound of the waves on the island. But they weren't calling me to a vacation. They were calling me to the end of a long, cold war. Richard was still downstairs, dreaming of his future with Chloe, unaware that he had just handed me the keys to his kingdom and the rope to hang himself. My hand went to the key in my pocket, and I smiled into the dark. The evening of the Founders' Gala arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. This was the biggest night on the social calendar, the kind of event where the air smells like expensive lilies and even more expensive desperation. Richard had been preparing for weeks. He told me it was a celebration of his firm's 30th anniversary, a night to cement his legacy. I knew better. To Richard, this was a coronation. He spent an hour in front of the mirror, adjusting his tuxedo and smoothing his hair. He looked like a man who believed he had already won the lottery twice. He was charming, he was attentive, and he was completely unaware that he was walking into a room where the floor was made of thin glass. I chose my dress with the precision of a general. It was a deep, midnight blue silk, modest and perfectly tailored. I didn't want to look like a woman trying to compete with a 25-year-old. I wanted to look like the woman who owned the building. I wore the pearls my father had given me, not the diamonds Richard had bought to appease his guilt. As I stood in the foyer of our home waiting for the car, Richard came up behind me. He smelled of cedar and confidence. "You look lovely, Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "It is a big night. Let us make sure everyone knows who the power couple of Greenwich is." I smiled at his reflection in the mirror. I told him that I wouldn't dream of being anywhere else. The museum was transformed into a wonderland of white orchids and shimmering candles. As we walked up the grand staircase, the photographer's flashes were like tiny bursts of lightning. Richard held my hand firmly, his chest puffed out. He loved the attention. He loved the way people whispered his name as we passed. We spent the first hour doing the usual dance. We shook hands with senators, we laughed at the dry jokes of bank presidents, and we accepted the hollow compliments of women who had been my friends for decades, but would drop me in a heartbeat if my credit score fell. I watched Richard carefully. He was scanning the room, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few minutes. He was waiting for her. He had told me he had a surprise for the evening. He said he wanted to introduce a new junior partner, a young woman with a brilliant mind for international markets. He said it was time for the firm to show its commitment to the next generation. It was a clever lie. By introducing Chloe as a business associate, he could have her by his side in public without the neighbors gossiping. He could test the waters, see how the world reacted to her, and slowly push me into the shadows. He thought he was being subtle. He didn't realize that I had already spoken to half the people in that room. I had spent my week making quiet phone calls, dropping hints about Richard's health and his recent erratic business decisions. I had planted seeds of doubt that were just beginning to sprout. At 9 o'clock, the chimes rang for dinner. Richard was led to the head table, and I sat to his right. The guest of honor was usually expected to give a short toast. Richard stood up, tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room went silent. He looked out over the sea of faces, his expression one of pure, unadulterated pride. "My friends," he began, his voice echoing in the marble hall. 30 years ago, I started with nothing but a dream and a very patient wife." A few people chuckled, and I tilted my head, giving him a gracious nod. But as we look to the future, we must embrace change. We must look for new blood, new energy, and new horizons. He went on for 10 minutes, talking about growth and the strength of his empire. He spoke as if he were a king describing his territory. He mentioned the new ventures in the islands, the very ones he had just signed over to our joint trust without realizing it. I sat there, sipping my water, watching the sweat glisten on his forehead under the bright chandeliers. He was so close to the edge. He finished his speech by saying that tonight was about more than just the past. It was about the bold steps we take when we find something worth fighting for. He raised his glass, and the room followed suit. The applause was loud, but to me, it sounded like the ticking of a clock. When he sat back down, he leaned in close to my ear. "I have to go to the lobby for a moment," he whispered. "The new partner has arrived, and she is a bit nervous about the crowd. I am going to bring her in and introduce her to the board members." I looked at him and placed my hand on his arm. "Of course, Richard, go and make her feel welcome. I will stay here and hold the fort." He squeezed my hand and stood up, disappearing into the crowd with a spring in his step. He looked like a teenager going to his first dance. I stayed in my seat for a moment, feeling the weight of the room. Several women approached me, offering their congratulations on the firm's success. I thanked them all with the same polite, distant smile. I could see the curiosity in their eyes. They knew something was happening. The air was thick with it. I stood up and walked toward the edge of the balcony, looking down at the grand entrance. I saw Richard. He was standing near the velvet ropes, looking at his watch. And then, the doors opened. Chloe walked in, and for a second, the room seemed to lose its breath. She was wearing a dress that was the color of a fresh wound, a vibrant, daring red that stood out against the sea of black and navy. It was expensive, far more expensive than a junior partner should be able to afford. She looked beautiful, but she looked out of place. She looked like a trophy, and every person in that room knew it. Richard took her hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm. He didn't just lead her, he displayed her. He began walking her through the crowd, stopping to introduce her to the men who held his fate in their hands. I watched him laugh, watched him touch her waist, watched him forget that I was even in the building. I didn't move. I stayed on the balcony, a silent observer of my own replacement. I saw the board members' faces. They weren't impressed. They were uncomfortable. They saw a man who had lost his judgment, a man who was flaunting a mistress at a charity gala while his wife sat 10 feet away. Richard was so blinded by his own reflection in her eyes that he couldn't see the disaster he was creating. He thought he was being bold. He thought he was a lion. He didn't realize he was a circus animal performing for an audience that was already bored of the show. As they moved closer to the head table, the path cleared for them. It was as if the crowd was parting to let a storm through. Richard was talking animatedly, pointing out different people, his face lit up with a terrifying kind of joy. Chloe was nodding, her eyes wide, trying to play the part of the professional, but her hand was gripping his sleeve too tightly. They reached the base of the stairs leading up to the balcony where I stood. Richard looked up. He saw me standing there, framed by the white orchids, the light hitting my pearls. His smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. It was the thrill of the risk. He wanted me to see. He wanted to see if I would break. He led her up the stairs, step by step, until they were standing directly in front of me. The people nearby stopped talking. The clinking of silverware died down. It was the moment he had planned for months. He cleared his throat, his voice steady and cold. "Evelyn," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "I would like you to meet Chloe. She is the newest addition to the firm, and I think she's going to be very important to our future." I didn't look at Richard. I looked at Chloe. I looked into her eyes, the eyes of the girl I had been having tea with all month. I saw the moment the recognition hit her. I saw the moment she realized that Diane was not a designer, and Diane was not her friend. She went pale, her mouth opening slightly as she looked from my face to the blue silk of my dress. She looked at the man she thought was her protector, and then she looked at me, the woman who knew all her secrets. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence stretch out between us, long and sharp. I raised my chin, my expression perfectly calm, and for the first time in 30 years, I saw the exact moment Richard realized he had made a mistake he could never take back. Richard's hand was still on Chloe's arm, his fingers digging in slightly as if to anchor her. He looked at me with a smirk that said he had finally won. He thought he had brought his new life right into the face of his old one, and that I would just have to accept it. The silence in the room was like a heavy blanket. People were leaning in, their faces tight with a mix of shock and delight. They were watching a train wreck in slow motion, and they did not want to miss a single second. Richard cleared his throat again, his voice echoing in the large hall. Chloe is a very talented woman, he repeated, his eyes darting around the room to see if anyone was going to challenge him. She has been working very closely with me on some of our most sensitive projects. I smiled at him, a slow, deliberate movement of my lips. I looked at Chloe and nodded. She looked like she was about to faint, her face so pale that her red dress looked like a splash of blood against the white marble. "It is okay, Chloe," I said softly. My voice was calm, the voice of a woman who had already seen the end of the movie. "You can tell him." Richard looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Tell me what?" he asked, his voice dropping into a low growl. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry cough. "Evelyn, what are you talking about? You do not even know her." Chloe took a step away from him. It was a small movement, but in that room, it felt like a mountain shifting. She reached into her small clutch bag. Her hands were shaking, but she did not stop. She pulled out a small digital voice recorder and a folded stack of papers. She did not look at Richard. She looked straight at me. "I have everything you asked for," she said. Her voice was thin, but it carried. Every account number, every transfer, and the recordings of his meetings about the offshore trust. Richard froze. He looked at the recorder in her hand as if it were a poisonous snake. "Chloe," he whispered. "What is this? What are they doing?" He reached out to take the recorder, but she pulled back, her eyes suddenly snapping with a spark of anger. She was not the scared girl anymore. She was a woman who realized she had been used. "I am doing what I should have done weeks ago," she said. She turned to the room, to the board members and the billionaires, who were standing frozen with their champagne glasses halfway to their mouths. "I want everyone to know that Richard did not hire me for my mind," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He hired me to be his shadow. He told me he was going to take everything from his wife and leave her with nothing. He told me he was going to use my name to hide his debts, but he did not know that I was talking to Evelyn the whole time. He did not know that the woman I was meeting for tea was actually his wife. The name Diane was not spoken, but the realization hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his hand hitting the edge of the table. The crystal glasses rattled. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You? You were the one?" I did not say anything. I just watched him. I watched the realization wash over him. The way a person watches a building collapse from a safe distance. He looked at Chloe, then back at me, his mouth working but no sound coming out. Chloe handed me the recorder and the papers. She had done her part. She had given me the final pieces of the puzzle. I took them from her and turned to Richard. "I told you that I wanted to protect our legacy, Richard," I said. "And I meant it. I just did not tell you that the legacy I was protecting was mine, not yours." I opened the folder and showed him the first page. It was a transcript of a recording he had made in his office, talking about how he was going to move money out of our joint accounts before the divorce. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Richard looked around at his peers, the men he had spent his life trying to impress. He saw the disgust on their faces. He saw the way they were already moving away from him, physically distancing themselves from the scandal. He was no longer the titan of industry. He was a man caught in a web of his own making, and I was the one holding the strings. He tried to speak, to spin it, to call us both liars, but the evidence was right there in my hand. He looked at the crowd, then at the balcony, then finally back at me. His face went from red to a sickly, grayish white. He realized that every single person in that room had just heard his mistress admit to his crimes. He realized that his reputation, the thing he valued more than anything else, was dead. It had died the second Chloe opened her mouth. I leaned in close to him, so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You should have been more careful with your passwords, Richard," I whispered. "And you should have never underestimated a woman who had 30 years to study your every move." I turned away from him and walked toward the center of the balcony. I looked out at the room, at the people who were now staring at me with a new kind of respect. I raised my glass, but I did not drink. I just held it up, a silent toast to the end of our marriage. Richard was standing behind me, a broken man in a perfect suit. He looked like he wanted to scream, but he knew that if he did, he would only make it worse. He was trapped in the most public way possible. He had brought his mistress to a gala to show her off, and instead, she had shown him for exactly what he was. The silence was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the heavy, loaded silence of 500 people holding their breath at once. I could feel the heat of the candles on my skin, and the weight of the digital recorder in my palm felt like a weapon. Richard was still frozen, his mouth slightly open, looking like a fish caught on a hook. He kept looking at Chloe as if he could make her take the words back just by staring at her. But Chloe was done with him. She stood tall, her shoulders back, looking more like a partner than she ever had when she was pretending for him. I looked at the board members sitting at the front table. These were men who had known Richard for decades. They had played golf with him, gone on fishing trips with him, and toasted to his successes. Now, they looked like they were looking at a stranger. Mr. Henderson, the oldest member of the board, slowly put down his fork. His eyes were fixed on the folder in my hand. "Richard," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Is this true?" Richard did not answer. He could not. He was drowning in the middle of a ballroom. I took a step forward, the silk of my dress rustling against the marble floor. It was the only sound in the room. I told the room that I had always been a woman of few words. I told them that I believed in loyalty and in the work we had done together. But I also told them that a house built on lies cannot stand. I opened the folder again and pulled out a sheet of paper that showed the recent transfers Richard had made to accounts in Chloe's name, the ones he thought were hidden. I showed it to Mr. Henderson. He put on his glasses and read the numbers, his face turning grimmer with every line. Richard finally found his voice, but it was not the voice of a leader. It was a high, thin sound. "This is a setup," he stammered. "Evelyn, you have lost your mind. You have paid this girl to lie." He looked at the crowd, pleading for someone to believe him. "She is just a disgruntled employee. She is nothing." But as he spoke, Chloe reached into her bag again and pulled out her phone. She pressed a button, and a recording began to play over the room's speakers. It was Richard's voice, clear and unmistakable. He was laughing, telling someone on the other end of the line that I was too simple to realize the house was being used as collateral for his new ventures. The recording played for nearly a minute. In it, Richard spoke about me with a contempt that made even the most hardened businessmen in the room flinch. He called me a relic. He called me a placeholder. He talked about how easy it was to trick me because I lived in my garden and my charity books. As his voice filled the hall, the shame in the room became almost physical. People looked away, unable to meet my eyes or his. Richard reached out and grabbed the edge of the podium to keep from falling. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I just felt a deep, cold satisfaction. I had spent years being the woman he described in that recording. I had played the part so well that he actually believed it. I had let him think I was small so that I could become the only thing he would ever fear. I looked at Chloe, and she gave me a small, sad nod. She knew that her life in this circle was over, but she also knew that I would keep my promise. I would make sure she was taken care of, far away from the wreckage of Richard's life. The man in the dark suit was getting closer now. He was walking with a purpose that cut through the crowd like a knife. Richard saw him and tried to turn away, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped on that balcony, surrounded by the people he had spent his life trying to impress, and they were all watching his downfall. The man reached the base of the stairs and looked up at us. "Richard," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to have a conversation about your recent filings." Richard looked at me, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. He was looking for a way out, a hand to hold, a lie to tell. But I just stood there, my glass raised in that silent toast. I was the one who had made the call. I was the one who had provided the documents. I was the one who had turned his big night into his final curtain call. The room stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a thunderclap. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, but I already knew. The masterpiece was finished. The chess match was over. And as the man in the suit reached the top of the stairs, I realized that the best part of the revenge was not the money or the house. It was the look on Richard's face when he realized that the silent wife had been the loudest person in the room all along. Richard looked at the man in the dark suit. His eyes were wide and darting around like a trapped animal. The man, whose name was Mr. Thorne, did not look impressed by Richard's tuxedo or his reputation. He handed Richard a single sheet of paper. It was a court order. I knew exactly what it said because I had spent 3 weeks making sure every comma and period was in the right place. It was a total freeze of all assets related to the firm and Richard's personal holdings. Richard laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound that had no humor in it. "You cannot do this," he said. "Do you know who I am? I have friends in the State House. I have lawyers who will have you working as a security guard by tomorrow morning." Mr. Thorne did not blink. He just stood there with his hands behind his back. "Sir, the order is from a federal judge," he said. "Your accounts were flagged for suspicious activity involving offshore transfers. Until the investigation is complete, you have no access to any funds." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking so much he almost dropped it. He needed to call Sam, his head of legal. He swiped the screen, but instead of his usual wallpaper of a mountain landscape, the screen was white. A small box popped up. "Device locked by administrator." He tapped the screen repeatedly, his breathing getting louder and more ragged. "This is a mistake," he hissed. "This is my personal phone." I stepped forward, the silk of my dress rustling softly. "No, Richard," I said. "It is a company phone. And according to the document you signed at dinner, I am now the majority stakeholder of the company. I decided to update our security protocols. I thought it was important to make sure no sensitive information was leaked during this difficult transition." He looked at the phone, then at me, then back at the phone. It was as if he was waiting for it to come back to life, but it stayed cold and dead in his hand. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and reached for his wallet. He pulled out a black credit card, the one that had no limit, the one he used to buy the diamond bracelet for Chloe. He looked around for a waiter. He needed a drink, or maybe he just needed to prove that the card still worked. He saw a server carrying a tray of champagne and waved the card at him. "Bring me a bottle of the vintage," he barked. The server looked at the card, then at me. I gave a small nod. The server took the card and walked over to the portable bar at the edge of the balcony. We all stood there in a strange, frozen circle. The guests were pretending to talk, but their heads were tilted toward us. Richard was staring at the bar, his jaw tight. A minute later, the server came back. He did not have a bottle of champagne. He had the black card on a small silver tray. "I am very sorry, sir," the server said. The transaction was declined. He did not say it quietly. He said it loud enough for the board members at the front table to hear. Richard snatched the card off the tray. "Try it again," he said. "It is a mistake." The server shook his head. "I tried it 3 times, sir. The system says the account is closed." Richard looked at the card as if it had turned into a piece of trash. He looked at the people around him, the people who had spent the night trying to get close to him, and saw them stepping back. It was like he had a disease. No one wanted to be near a man whose card was declined at his own party. He turned to me, his face twisted with a mixture of hate and desperation. "What did you do?" he whispered. I took a slow sip of my water. "I did not do anything, Richard. I just stopped protecting you. I stopped making sure the bills were paid from my family's trust. I stopped covering the holes you were digging. You always said you were a self-made man. I thought it was time to see what you could make on your own." He didn't stay to argue. He couldn't. The weight of all those eyes was too much for him. He turned and started walking toward the stairs. He was moving fast, almost running. He wanted to get out of the building. He wanted to get into his Bentley and drive away, maybe to a hotel or to a friend who hadn't heard the news yet. I followed him at a distance, walking slowly. I wanted to see the end. We reached the front of the museum. The cool night air hit us, smelling of rain and car exhaust. The valet was standing by the podium, looking at the long line of luxury cars waiting to be picked up. Richard walked right up to him and held out his hand. "The Bentley," he said. "Black. Now." The valet, a young man who had always been terrified of Richard's temper, did not move to get the keys. He looked at a clipboard in his hand. "I am sorry, Mr. Sterling," the valet said, "but that vehicle was just picked up by a transport company." Richard blinked. "What are you talking about?" "I'm standing right here." The valet pointed toward the street. A large flatbed truck was pulling away from the curb. On the back of it, tied down with heavy yellow straps, was Richard's black Bentley. A man in a high-visibility vest was standing on the sidewalk, taking a picture of the car on the truck. "That is my car!" Richard screamed. He started to run toward the truck, but Mr. Thorne, who had followed us out, put a hand on his shoulder. "Actually, sir, that car is registered to the firm," Mr. Thorne said. "And as part of the asset freeze, all company vehicles are being impounded for the audit." Richard stopped. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, his tuxedo jacket flapping in the wind. The truck turned the corner and was gone. He stood there for a long time, looking at the empty space where his car had been. He reached into his pocket again, looking for his car keys, but he realized they were useless now. He reached for his phone again, but it was still a dead piece of glass. He looked up and down the street. In this part of the city, at this time of night, there were no taxis. He didn't have a car, he didn't have a working phone, and he didn't have a single dollar that he could spend. He looked back at the museum. The lights were bright, and the music was still playing. He could see the silhouettes of the guests through the windows, laughing and drinking. He was only 50 feet away from them, but he might as well have been on another planet. He was a man who had spent 30 years making sure he was never stranded, never powerless, and never alone. And now, he was all three. I walked up to the edge of the stairs and looked down at him. He looked so small from up there. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to walk because he had always been carried. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the fear. It was not the fear of going to jail or losing his house. It was the fear of being nobody. Without the car, the phone, and the money, Richard did not know who he was. "Do you need a ride, Richard?" I asked. My voice was light, almost cheerful. He did not answer. He just stared at me. I walked down to the curb, where my own car, a silver sedan that I had bought with my own inheritance, was waiting. My driver, a man who had worked for my father for 20 years, opened the door for me. I got in and looked out the window at Richard. He was still standing on the sidewalk, a lonely figure in a dark suit, surrounded by the ghosts of his own success. As my car pulled away, I looked back one last time. He was reaching into his pocket again, A reflex he could not stop. He was looking for something, anything, that still belonged to him. But I knew he would find nothing. The freeze was complete. The world had moved on without him, and he was left standing in the dark, waiting for a car that was never coming back. But as we drove away, I saw a black car pull up slowly to the curb where Richard stood. It was not the Bentley. It was a plain, unmarked sedan. 2 men got out, and they were not valets. They were wearing badges. I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The first part of the night was over, but the real investigation was just beginning. And I knew that when they opened the black ledger I had left for them, they would find things that even I had not expected. The conference room was on the 50th floor, a space made entirely of glass and cold, white marble. Outside, the city was a blur of gray clouds and distant traffic. But inside, the silence was so thick you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I arrived early. I wanted to be the one already seated, the one who owned the space. My lawyer, Sarah, sat next to me. She didn't have a mountain of messy files or a stressed expression. She had one single slim leather folder and a silver pen. She looked like she was waiting for a theater performance to begin, not a legal battle that would end a 30-year marriage. Richard arrived 20 minutes late. It was an old power move of his, a way to show that his time was more valuable than anyone else's. But when he walked through the door, the move failed. He didn't look like a man in control. His suit, which usually looked like a second skin, seemed a size too large. His face was puffy, and he hadn't quite managed to hide the dark circles under his eyes. He sat down across from me without saying a word. His lawyer, a gray-haired man named Arthur, who had represented Richard for years, looked exhausted. Arthur didn't even try to make small talk. He just opened his briefcase and took out a yellow legal pad. Sarah didn't wait for them to settle in. She opened her folder and slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the post-nuptial agreement Richard had signed just weeks ago, the one he thought was a romantic gesture to save our marriage. I watched as Arthur put on his glasses and read the highlighted section. It was the clause about financial infidelity. In simple language, it stated that if either spouse attempted to hide, transfer, or shield marital assets in anticipation of a separation, that spouse would forfeit their entire share of the marital estate. Richard leaned forward, his voice a low hiss. "That was a trick, Evelyn. You knew I was moving money. You set me up to sign a document that you knew I would break." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I told him that I hadn't forced him to hide $40 million in offshore accounts. I hadn't forced him to buy a penthouse in Chloe's name. I had simply asked him to be honest, and he had chosen to be a thief. The document wasn't a trick. It was a mirror. It showed exactly who he was. And now he had to live with the reflection. Arthur leaned over and whispered something in Richard's ear. Richard shook his head violently. "No," he said out loud. "There has to be a way to fight this. It's unconscionable. It's a lopsided agreement." Sarah smiled then, and it was the sharpest thing in the room. She reminded Arthur that Richard had been represented by his own independent counsel when he signed it, a junior associate at Arthur's own firm whom Richard had bullied into signing off without a full review. Richard had been so arrogant, so sure that I was a fool, that he hadn't even let his best people look at the fine print. He had cheated himself. The next hour was a quiet, clinical dissection of a life. Sarah went down the list of assets like she was reading a grocery list. The estate in Greenwich stayed with me. The apartment in Paris stayed with me. The investment portfolios, the retirement accounts, and the family trust stayed with me. Richard's eyes moved from the paper to the window and back again. He looked like he was trying to calculate the numbers in his head, trying to find a version of the math where he didn't end up with 0. But the math was solid. The paper trail I had gathered, with Chloe's help and the anonymous tips, was a map that led directly to his downfall. Richard tried one last time to appeal to my emotions. "Evelyn, we have kids," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're going to leave me on the street? After everything I built for this family?" I looked at him and felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, just a profound sense of relief. I reminded him that he wasn't being left on the street. He still had his salary from the firm, at least until the board finished their investigation into his expense reports. He had his personal belongings. He had the clothes on his back and the watch on his wrist. I told him that he was leaving with exactly what he had brought into the marriage 30 years ago: an ego and a suitcase. The house in Greenwich was the hardest part for him. He loved that house because it was a trophy. He loved the long driveway and the way the gates impressed his business partners. I told him he had 48 hours to pack his personal items. I told him that my security team would be there to ensure that nothing belonging to the estate, not a single piece of art, not a single bottle of wine from the cellar, left the premises. He looked like he wanted to scream, but he knew that any outburst would only make the legal process faster and more painful. He was a man who lived by the rules of the contract, and now the contract was eating him alive. Arthur eventually put his pen down. He looked at Richard and gave a small, slow nod. It was over. There was no leverage left. If they went to court, the evidence of Richard's fraud would become a matter of public record, and he would likely face criminal charges for tax evasion and money laundering. By signing the divorce decree today, he was losing his fortune, but he was staying out of a prison cell. It was the only deal he had left, and it was a terrible one. Richard picked up the silver pen. His hand was steady now, a final act of pride. He signed his name on the final page of the decree. He didn't look at me as he did it. He signed with the same bold loops he used for multi-million-dollar deals, but this time, the ink was a surrender. He pushed the papers back toward Sarah and stood up. He didn't wait for his lawyer. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing on the marble, until the heavy glass door clicked shut behind him. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. It was finally done. The 30 years of being the silent wife, the decades of managing his moods and his mistakes, were over. I felt lighter than I had in a lifetime. Sarah gathered the papers and placed them neatly back into her leather folder. She looked at me and gave a small, professional smile. "Congratulations, Evelyn," she said. "You're a free woman." She closed the folder with a firm, final snap. The sound was like a gavel hitting a block. It was the sound of a door closing on the past and a window opening on a future that belonged entirely to me. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. It was a beautiful view, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was looking at Richard's world. I was looking at mine. But as I turned to leave, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out one more envelope. This wasn't part of the divorce papers. It was small, cream-colored, and had no return address. She handed it to me. "This was delivered to my office this morning," she said. "It's addressed to you, but it's marked as urgent." I took the envelope and felt a familiar chill. The handwriting was the same as the notes that had helped me win. I opened it and found a single key and a small slip of paper with an address for a storage unit in New Jersey. The note said, "Richard didn't just hide money from you. He hid the truth about your father's company. Look in the blue trunk." I looked at the key in my hand. The divorce was over, but it seemed the story was just beginning. Richard thought he had lost everything, but I was starting to realize that I didn't even know what I had truly lost all those years ago. I walked out of the glass room, the key heavy in my pocket, already planning my next move. The morning light in my new kitchen is different than it was in the big house. In Greenwich, the sun had to fight through heavy velvet curtains and thick, bulletproof glass. It always felt like the light was being filtered through money. But here, In this smaller house by the shore, the sun comes in clean and sharp. The cabinets are a soft, creamy white, and the countertops are a warm wood that feels good under my hands. I spent 30 years surrounded by cold marble and gold leaf, thinking that was what success looked like. Now I realize success is just being able to drink a cup of coffee without wondering if the man sitting across from me is lying about the time. I do not have a housekeeper anymore. I like it that way. I like the sound of the kettle whistling and the way the steam fogs up the window over the sink. I like knowing where every spoon is and knowing that I was the one who put it there. I was making a simple piece of toast when I decided to turn on the small television I keep on the counter. I usually avoid the news, but today, I felt a strange curiosity. I wanted to see how the other half was living. Or, more accurately, how the other half was surviving. The local news was doing a segment on the recent shakeups in the financial district. I waded through the weather and a story about a cat stuck in a tree. And then there he was. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Sterling assets frozen amid federal probe." The camera was shaky, the kind of footage someone takes with a phone while running down a sidewalk. Richard was walking out of a plain brown brick building in a part of the city he used to call the armpit of the world. It was a mid-range apartment complex, the kind of place where people have to carry their own groceries up the stairs. He looked terrible. It had only been a few weeks since the gala, but he looked like he had aged a decade. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, but it was wrinkled and stained at the lapel. He hadn't had a haircut, and the gray at his temples was turning into a wild, unkempt white. He was carrying a cardboard box filled with what looked like old files and a single desk lamp. There was no driver waiting for him. There was no black sedan with tinted windows. He had to stand on the curb and wait for a rideshare car to pull up. A reporter with a microphone jumped in front of him, asking him if he had any comment on the allegations of tax evasion. Richard stopped and looked at the camera. For a second, I saw the old Richard. He opened his mouth to bark an insult, to tell the man he was fired, to threaten a lawsuit. But then the light went out of his eyes. He realized he didn't have anyone to fire. He didn't have a lawyer on retainer who could stop the broadcast. He just looked confused. He looked like a man who had woken up in a language he didn't speak. He mumbled something about a misunderstanding and ducked into the back of a dented silver car that smelled, I am sure, of cheap air freshener and old fast food. I took a bite of my toast and watched the car drive away. I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't hate him. Hate is too much work, and I have worked enough for one lifetime. I just felt like I was watching a character in a movie I had seen before. He was in exile, and the worst part for him wasn't the lack of money. It was the lack of an audience. Richard only existed if people were looking at him with envy. In that cheap apartment with appealing wallpaper and the sound of the neighbor's television coming through the walls, he was invisible. He was just another man who had lost his way. I turned off the television and went back to my coffee. The house was so quiet. It is a beautiful kind of quiet, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts. I thought about the storage unit in New Jersey. The key was sitting on the counter next to my fruit bowl. I hadn't gone there yet. I wanted to enjoy my victory for a few days before I opened another door into the past. Richard had kept so many secrets, and I knew that the blue trunk mentioned in the note would hold the biggest one of all. It was about my father, who had started the company that Richard eventually took over. My father, who had died thinking Richard was the son he never had. I remembered how Richard used to talk about my father. He called him a visionary but said he was too soft for the modern world. He told me that he had saved the company from my father's old-fashioned ideas. I had believed him. I was 22 and in love, and I thought Richard was a hero. Now I wondered if the hero had actually been a predator from the very beginning. I wondered if the reason Richard wanted to leave me with nothing was because he knew that everything he had actually belonged to my bloodline. not his. I finished my breakfast and washed my plate. I took my time, enjoying the feeling of the warm water on my hands. I am learning to be slow. For 30 years, I was always rushing to meet Richard's needs, to be at the door when he got home, to have the guest list ready, to make sure the children were perfect. Now, the only person I have to please is myself. I went into the living room and sat in the chair by the window. I have a view of the salt marsh, and I watched a white heron land in the tall grass. It was so graceful and so solitary. I felt a connection to it. My phone buzzed on the side table. I picked it up, expecting it to be my lawyer or perhaps one of my children calling to check in. But it was a text message from a number I hadn't saved. I knew who it was immediately. There are only a few people who have my private number now. The message was short and simple. It said, "We did good, Evelyn. He never saw the second wave coming. Check the mail tomorrow. You are going to love the photos from the apartment." It was Chloe. We were not friends, and we never would be, but we were partners in a way that Richard could never understand. She had stayed in the city, and she was keeping an eye on him for me. She was the one who had told the reporters where he was staying. She was the one who had made sure the asset freeze hit him at the exact moment he was trying to sign a new lease. She was his shadow, just like I had been, but she was a shadow that had learned how to bite. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. We had an understanding. She got her freedom and a fresh start, and I got my justice. I put the phone down and looked back out at the marsh. The heron was still there, standing perfectly still, waiting for the right moment to strike. I realized that Richard thought the battle was over because the divorce was signed. He thought he was just living through a streak of bad luck. He didn't realize that every single thing happening to him, the car being towed, the phone being locked, the reporters at his door, was a part of a choreographed dance. I reached out and touched the key to the storage unit. It felt cold against my skin. I knew that tomorrow I would have to drive to New Jersey. I would have to open that blue trunk and face whatever lies Richard had buried there 30 years ago. I knew it would be painful. I knew it would probably change everything I thought I knew about my family. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had survived the worst thing a woman like me could face. I had survived being discarded by the person I trusted most. I stood up and went to the hallway to get my coat. I decided to take a walk along the beach. The air would be cold and the wind would be strong, but I wanted to feel it. I wanted to feel the world moving around me. Richard was sitting in a dark room, staring at a wall, wondering how he had ended up there. I was walking into the light, ready to find the rest of the truth. He thought he had exiled me to a quiet life of insignificance. He didn't realize that he was the one in exile. I was finally home. The tide was coming in, the waves licking at the sand with a soft, rhythmic sound. I walked for a long time, thinking about the text from Chloe. She had said he never saw the second wave coming. She was right. Richard always looked for the big attacks, the loud arguments, and the visible enemies. He never looked for the silent wife or the quiet girl. He never looked for the people he thought he had already defeated. As I looked out at the ocean, I realized that the blue trunk was just the beginning of the next chapter. Richard had stolen my past, but I was going to make sure he had no future. The game was far from over, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the deck. The restaurant I chose for our lunch was miles away from the gold leaf dining rooms of Manhattan. It sat on the edge of a quiet pier, a place where the air smelled of salt, and the only music was the sound of the tide hitting the wooden pilings. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do. I sat at a corner table with a view of the water, watching the seagulls dive for scraps. I wore a simple cream-colored linen suit and no jewelry other than a watch. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel like I was on display. I wasn't the wife of a titan. I was just Evelyn. When Chloe walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She had cut her long blonde hair into a sharp, professional bob. The bright red dress she wore to the gala was gone, replaced by a dark green sweater and a pair of tailored trousers. She looked older, but in a good way. She looked like someone who finally knew where she was standing. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on me, and for a second, she hesitated. Then, she squared her shoulders and walked over. She didn't look like a mistress. She looked like a survivor. She sat down across from me and took a deep breath. "I thought you might not show up," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could see her fingers twisting a napkin under the table. I told her that I always keep my appointments. I ordered us both a pot of green tea and some light sandwiches. The silence between us wasn't cold like it used to be. It was heavy with the weight of everything we had done to get to this table. I looked at her and realized that we were the only two people in the world who truly knew who Richard was. We had both seen him without the mask, and it had cost us both a great deal. "I want to apologize," she said, looking down at her tea. "Not just for the affair. I want to apologize for being so blind. I thought I was special. I thought he loved me for who I was." I felt a small pang of pity for her. I told her that she shouldn't be too hard on herself. Richard had spent decades perfecting his act. He knew exactly what she needed to hear, because he knew exactly what she was missing in her own life. He didn't love her, and he didn't love me. He only loved the way we made him feel. To him, we were just mirrors that reflected back the version of himself he wanted to see. Chloe looked up at me, a small, sad smile on her lips. "And Diane?" she asked. "Was any of that real?" I laughed softly. "Diane was the woman I would have been if I hadn't met Richard when I was 22, I told her. She was the version of me that didn't have to hide her intelligence to make a man feel bigger. So, in a way, Diane was more real than the wife you met at the gala." Chloe nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. She told me that she had moved out of the apartment Richard had bought for her. She had sold the jewelry and the bags he gave her, and moved into a small studio near the university. She was going back to finish her degree in business. "That is why I asked you here," I said, leaning forward. "I am starting a new venture. I am taking the remnants of my father's old company and rebuilding it from the ground up. I don't want the old guard. I don't want the men who worked for Richard and looked the other way while he drained the accounts. I want people who know how to spot a lie from a mile away. I want people who have nothing left to lose." Chloe stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "You want me to work for you?" she asked. I told her that she had a talent for research and a sharp eye for detail. I reminded her that she was the one who found the account numbers in the black ledger. She had a mind for the numbers that Richard never respected. I told her that I needed a junior partner who understood that business isn't just about the money on the screen, but about the people behind it. I offered her a position helping me audit the files I was recovering from the storage unit. It wouldn't be glamorous, and it wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest. It would be hers. She didn't answer right away. She looked out at the water, watching a boat move slowly across the horizon. I didn't push her. I knew she needed to process the fact that the woman she had helped betray was now offering her a hand. I watched the way the sunlight hit her face and saw the exhaustion there. She had been through a war, just like I had. We were on opposite sides, but we were both casualties of the same man. I realized that if we could work together, we would be unstoppable. Richard had counted on our jealousy to keep us apart. He never imagined that we would find common ground in his ruin. "I will do it," she said finally. Her eyes were bright, and for the first time, I saw a flash of real ambition in them. "But I want to be clear. I am not doing this because I feel like I owe you. I am doing this because I want to build something that he can't touch." I smiled and told her that was exactly the answer I was looking for. We spent the rest of the lunch talking about the logistics. I told her about the blue trunk and the secrets I suspected were inside. I told her about the legal team I had assembled and the way we were going to reclaim my father's legacy. As we finished our meal and stood up to leave, the atmosphere felt different. The tension had vanished, replaced by a quiet, professional energy. We walked out of the restaurant and onto the pier. The wind was picking up, blowing the scent of salt and sea spray into our faces. I looked at Chloe and saw that she wasn't looking back at the city. She was looking forward, toward the water. She was ready. I realized then that the strangest alliances really do come from the worst betrayals. Richard had tried to use us against each other, but in doing so, he had forced us to see the truth. He had stripped away our illusions until there was nothing left but our own strength. We weren't the wife and the mistress anymore. We were two women who had decided that we were done being the supporting characters in a man's story. We were the lead actors now, and we were writing our own script. I walked Chloe to her car and told her I would call her on Monday morning. She thanked me, not with the submissive tone of an employee, but with the nod of an equal. As I watched her drive away, I felt a sense of completion. The circle was closing. Richard was alone in his dark apartment, and I was standing on a pier with a new partner and a new purpose. The revenge was sweet, but the rebuilding was going to be even better. But as I got into my own car, my mind went back to the blue trunk. I had been avoiding it, but now I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I reached into my bag and pulled out the key. It felt heavy, like it carried the weight of my father's entire life. I thought about the note that said Richard hadn't just stolen the money, but the truth. I started the engine and began the drive to the storage unit in New Jersey. The sun was starting to set, casting long orange shadows across the road. I knew that whatever I found in that trunk would be the final piece of the puzzle, and I had a feeling that the person who had been sending me the notes was waiting for me to find it. The next move wasn't just about Richard. It was about a secret that had been buried for 30 years, and I was the only one left to dig it up.